Yikes, so a new study just released has suggested that about 22% of Canadians have just or are about to completely be out of money. Now, this is amid another interest rate hike from the Bank of Canada this week that counterintuitively makes things more expensive while they're trying to make things less expensive. Now, all the while, Canada's government is set to go back to the House of Commons for the first time since their winter break began on December 15th of 2022. Now, this has led to both the opposition leader Pierre Poilievre and the Prime Minister trading jabs as they sort of talk about what they're going to do about this cost of living crisis. So let's take a closer look at this study and talk about how the Bank of Canada's latest moves changes things for Canadians and what our leaders are planning to do about all of this. So let's dive right into this information and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. So this study was done by Ipsos, which is one of the world's largest research firms, and the headline here is growing proportion, 22%, a raise of 3% since the last time this study was done, of Canadians are completely out of money, saying there's no way that they can pay more for household necessities. Now inside this study, there are a number of other interesting numbers that we need to take a look at as well. Here there are a number of different questions, and in this box it tracks what percentage of people either responded with "I am very concerned" or "I am somewhat concerned." 81% of people are concerned about inflation in general, making things less affordable for you. 52% of people are concerned that they won't have enough money to feed their family. 52% of people are concerned that they won't be able to afford a holiday this summer. 56% of people are concerned that they're not going to be able to afford gasoline in the new year. And 68% of people are worried that interest rates will continue to rise quicker than you can adjust. More on that in a minute. In this next section is where the headline actually comes from. The question is thinking about inflation and the rising cost of household necessities like food, clothing, transportation, and shelter. Which of the following is closest to your point of view? And we can see the different response options here. The first one, my household can easily absorb increased costs. With some adjustments to how we spend our money, we can absorb these costs. With some major changes to how we spend, we're going to be able to find a way to pay for these costs. And then here's where the headline strikes is we are completely out of money. There is no way that we can pay more for household necessities. Now, 13% of Canadians are saying, okay, this isn't a big issue for me. Costs are going up. I've got a lot of money either saved up or I make a lot of money. We can absorb these interest costs. And then we see 66% of people saying that with some slight changes to how we spend our money or some more major changes to how we spend and how we budget, we're going to be fine. We're going to be able to pay for these increased costs. But then a whopping 22%, up from 19% last time this survey was done, are saying we're completely out of money. There's no way that we can pay more for household necessities. And this means that people who are pushed into this situation with the rising costs of necessities like shelter and food, well, they have to turn to either payday loans or maxing out their credit cards in order to continue to pay for this rising cost of living, and that's a big problem. And of course, the reason things are trending in this direction is because of the record high inflation we've been experiencing over the past year. However, it is on quite a downtrend as of late, and the Bank of Canada thinks that this downtrend is very likely to continue moving forward. Of course, they would be incentivized to say that because they want people to believe that inflation is going to go down. But when we look at the most recent numbers, we can see that the CPI total is around 6.3% as of today, although the Bank of Canada is looking at this CPI trim number, the yellow box there. That CPI trim sort of cuts out some of the most volatile elements of the CPI or the consumer price index, the number we use to track inflation. They sort of cut out gasoline costs and food costs because they say, okay, we're not really in control of that. Those are global markets and they go up and down very quickly. So not looking at those food and energy prices, they're seeing inflation sort of level out and not necessarily go on a downtrend, but sort of just level out at that 5% CPI trim number. Now, even if inflation were to get back to historical averages around the 2% mark, that doesn't mean that prices have actually come down at all. It just means that there is less of an inflationary pressure, or prices are increasing at a slower rate. They're still going to increase even when the Bank of Canada has it right at the point that they want it to be at, which is 2% or anywhere between 1% and 3% as their acceptable band. And of course, that's the Bank of Canada's main job, is to bring inflation down, and they released some new projections as of this week as to when they think inflation is going to hit the places that they want it to hit. They say that we're going to be back down to that 3% mark by mid-2023. Now, that's only 6 months away, so they're expecting some big moves here in terms of the inflation numbers that we see over the next 5 months, and then they say by sometime in 2024, we'll be back down to that 2% target. That's kind of the sweet spot where the Bank of Canada is actually targeting for inflation to be. But of course, the only way that they can do that, continuing to bring down inflation, is with the only tool that they have in their tool belt, the hammer of raising interest rates. And the raising of interest rates sort of counterintuitively in the short term increases the expenses that Canadians have to pay, because Canadians who are exposed to any sort of debt that they have to pay interest on, well, they're impacted almost immediately by these interest rate changes, especially folks who have high ticket loans, like for a car or for a home, especially if it's on a variable rate mortgage. And it's one of those cases where when you only have a hammer, every single problem looks like a nail, right? The Bank of Canada has to hurt low-income individuals by raising interest rates, because that's the only way that they can hammer down inflation, right? Every problem is a nail when you only have a hammer. And for families with a little bit of extra income or savings, this isn't as bad, because when the price of necessities goes up, they can absorb those increased costs. Things like food and shelter, we've seen rent and mortgage costs go up dramatically alongside food prices. But for Canadians, like many of the people who responded that they were totally out of money in this survey, well, things are going to be much, much harder. When you're already tight for money and the basic necessities go up in price, you don't have any room to buffer there. You just have to either stop buying necessities or go into debt to pay for these costs. And this is actually something that the Bank of Canada recognizes. They know that what they're doing is going to be especially painful for lower income Canadians, and that's something that they talked about in their press conference earlier this week, and I'll show you right now the message that they wanted to leave Canadians with. Take a look at this.
We know inflation's still too high, and we know that's affecting Canadians. We're acutely aware that low-income Canadians are disproportionately affected by this high inflation. They don't have extra savings to buffer the price increases, and some of the largest price increases have been in essentials, in groceries. Food prices are still going up 11%. Rent is rising. Rent is increasing. These are essentials. These are not things that you can cut back on. So we're acutely aware that Canadians are feeling that. I think our second message is the Bank of Canada has done a lot. We've raised rates now 425 basis points on a cumulative basis over the last year. That is putting an increased burden on Canadians that have high debt loads. That is stretching them. But what we see is that, as these interest rate increases are working through the economy, they are working to rebalance demand. Inflation is coming down. And yes, we're going to have a period of virtually no growth for the next few quarters. But as inflation comes down, the growth will be restored, and it's going to be worth it.
Now, these days, times are actually good for a lot of Canadians who can absorb these costs, something that Pierre Poilievre is going to point out in a clip in just a few minutes. But the Bank of Canada is pointing out here that it's not only low-income Canadians that they're going to be hurting by keeping these interest rates high for the next while, as they've signaled a pause for the next while, that they're not going to continue to raise interest rates. But it's also the Canadians who are, like we talked about before, exposed to high loan-to-value debt, things like cars and real estate. And that lines up exactly with comments from a real estate lawyer that was recently interviewed in a Globe and Mail article, saying that the stars are aligned for a bloodletting when it comes to people who got loans from non-A lenders. We refer to the big banks as A lenders, typically the lowest fees, the lowest interest rates, but many people during the boom of the pandemic in real estate turned to less traditional lenders like B lenders, credit unions, or even private sort of investors that will give out these higher interest rate, higher fee mortgages. And they continue to say that many who bought with a typical 20% down payment in a mortgage for the other 80% have seen the value of their property slide more than 30%, which puts the mortgage underwater. Of course, saying a mortgage is underwater is saying you owe more on the property than it's worth. You wouldn't be able to pay your debt if you were to sell the property. Now, many of you might be thinking, and there will be this criticism, that folks should have known better than to enter into a high loan-to-value mortgage at the very top of the market. But I will push back a little bit and say that it's very easy to call the top of a market after it's already happened and when you can look back at it, but it's incredibly difficult to do in the moment. Many potential homeowners were watching the market just absolutely rip up and feeling the pressure of possibly missing out and never being able to afford a home if values kept rising. They didn't really know that prices were going to come down in the near future, and the Bank of Canada sort of signaled that they were going to keep interest rates low for a long time, something that they've sort of pivoted on since April of last year. But fingers aren't only being pointed at the Bank of Canada for this higher cost of living and the nearly 25% of Canadians who are saying that they're totally out of money given the current situation. Others are also pointing to the government and questioning whether or not things have been mismanaged, making the situation worse entirely. Now, this is very interesting to look at, especially as of today, because next week, for the first time in a long time, the House of Commons will sit again. They left for their winter break around December 14th was the last day, and then if we look forward into 2023, we can see that Monday of next week, January 30th, is when they will be back in the House of Commons and when they can, again, bring new legislation that could actually help Canadians with this rising cost of living, any kind of measures to try to help them with this situation. Because of this new session of Parliament happening, this new sitting over a sort of 3-month period here, it's very important to look at what the leaders of each party are saying headed into this new session. So let's take a quick look at some highlights that I put together here from the recent speeches that both Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservatives, the leader of the opposition, as well as Justin Trudeau, the current Prime Minister, have just given these speeches. Here are some highlights from it. They trade some jabs back and forth at each other.
What's happening in our country? Seriously, look around you. Crime is raging out of control in our streets. Our people are desperate that they'll have to lose their homes because of rising inflation and interest rates the government promised would never happen. Everything feels broken. Oh, I just offended Justin Trudeau. He gets very angry when I talk about these problems. He thinks that if we don't speak about them out loud, that Canadians will forget that they exist. He said this to me in a very angry speech right before Christmas, where he told 2,000 Liberal lobbyists and political staffers and consultants who'd paid $500 to listen to him speak that Canadians have never had it so good. And you know what? For the people in that room, he's absolutely right. They have never had it so good. The $1,000 a day consultants at McKinsey have never had it so good. In fact, the consulting contracts that he's given up have gone up 100% in the 8 years since he took office. Justin, these people are very grateful to you. That's why they are donating so much to your party. If you don't believe me, Justin, come speak to the students who live in homeless shelters while they go to school, because the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in Toronto after 8 years of your leadership is $2,500 a month. That's more than a 100% increase since you took office, and you've done absolutely nothing to incentivize the construction of new and affordable homes for our young people. Everything is worse, and you blame everyone else. And we know what you will do this session of Parliament. You will divide to distract. You'll try to make people afraid of each other because you think that if an average Canadian is afraid of his neighbor, he'll forget that he can't feed himself or pay the rent. You'll try to take all of the responsibility off of yourself and to put it on others.
We're beginning a new year, and more than ever, it's important to reaffirm our positive vision for a stronger future together. These are difficult times right now. This is a pivotal moment, not just for our country, but for the whole world. This is what our positive vision for the future is all about. Good jobs for the middle class, safe communities with clean air where families and workers are supported and where everyone has a real and fair chance at success, an economy that works for all Canadians. When the world is more stable, we are all safer and more prosperous, including here at home. And as we're doing our part around the world, we're reminded that we can't take for granted what we have here in Canada. Every day, we must be ready to fight for our values, for our institutions, and mostly for Canadians. Now, there are politicians like Mr. Poilievre who have no real solutions to offer and who just try to exploit the anger and concerns that people do have. The Liberal vision for the future could not be more different than Mr. Poilievre's version. With our investments, Canada's gone from 5th to 2nd in the world when it comes to battery supply chain, and we've secured thousands of good middle-class jobs. See, hardworking Canadians are building Canada's clean tech ecosystem. And while we were doing all this work last year, Mr. Poilievre was out talking about how we should all invest in Bitcoin to opt out of inflation after he watched videos on YouTube about it. Now, we all like YouTube, but it matters what content you watch and what you choose to amplify. Peddling misinformation and disinformation has serious and devastating consequences. Mr. Poilievre has made a deliberate choice. But we, all of you in this room, have been there day in and day out to deliver for and to reassure our constituents through these tough times by sticking to facts and science. I know we all want to forget about that pandemic. I get it. But as we get a little distance, I'm hearing more and more reflections on the early days of it, of how we were there for each other. We should remember, all of us, when we were all in this together. Let's build an economy that works for all Canadians, and let's build a Canada where people thrive and where future generations will directly benefit from us having chosen to meet this moment. Merci beaucoup, mes amis.
Now, no matter your political leaning, this will certainly be a challenging time for Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, with more Canadians struggling and a hesitancy from that government to provide high-cost supports, given the fears of that spending stoking further inflation. This all coming while Trudeau's seeing lower approval ratings than Poilievre, the opposition leader, for one of the first times since Poilievre took power here. But obviously we covered a lot today, that study, the Bank of Canada's recent moves, and what the politicians are saying, and I'm curious what you think about all of it. Leave me a comment down in the comment section. I read every single one and try to get back to a bunch of them. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. And with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. Really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.